The June sun blazed down on the immaculate grounds of the Normandy American Cemetery. Rows of white crosses stretched toward the sea, standing in silent formation like the soldiers they commemorated. Among the gathered crowd of veterans, dignitaries, and families, one figure stood apart. Richard Shadow Sullivan sat ramrod straight in his wheelchair, his weathered hands resting on the worn arms. At 88, his body had finally begun to betray him, but his mind remained as sharp as the day he'd landed on these shores. His dress uniform, adorned with medals and ribbons, still fit his frame, though more loosely than it once had. The dark blue fabric contrasted with his shock of white hair. Beside him stood his grandson, Captain Mark Sullivan, 35, his own dress uniform crisp and perfect. The younger Sullivan placed a hand on his grandfather's shoulder as they watched the ceremony marking the 80th anniversary of D-Day unfold before them. "Ladies and gentlemen," the speaker at the podium announced, "it is my distinct honor to recognize a true American hero with us today. A man whose innovative tactics and leadership helped turn the tide against German armor in the difficult months following the Normandy invasion. Please join me in honoring retired Colonel Richard Sullivan, recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross and one of the first commanders of the M36 tank destroyer." Applause rippled across the assembly. Mark squeezed his grandfather's shoulder. "That's quite a build-up, Grandpa." The old man snorted. "Lot of hot air. I just did what needed doing." As the ceremony continued, Sullivan's gaze drifted beyond the speaker to the English Channel, glittering in the distance. The same waters that had carried him and countless others to these shores so long ago. The same waters that had run red with American blood. When the formalities concluded, Mark wheeled his grandfather toward the small military museum near the cemetery grounds. The special exhibition commemorating the armored divisions of World War II had been the real reason for their journey from the States. Inside the climate-controlled building, they moved slowly past displays of equipment, photographs, and maps. Sullivan barely glanced at most of it. He had lived it. He didn't need reminders. Then they turned a corner, and there it was. Restored to pristine condition, its olive drab paint gleaming under the museum lights, an M36 Jackson tank destroyer dominated the center of the hall. Sullivan's breath caught. His hands gripped the arms of his wheelchair so tightly his knuckles whitened. "There she is," he whispered. "My God, there she is." Mark studied the vehicle with professional interest. As a commander of an M1 Abrams tank, he appreciated the heritage of American armor. "Hard to believe something that looks so similar to a Sherman could have made such a difference," Mark observed. "Looks can be deceiving," Sullivan replied, his eyes never leaving the M36, "just like the histories they write in books." A museum docent approached, offering to provide information about the exhibit. When Mark introduced his grandfather as a former M36 commander, the young man's eyes widened. "Sir, it would be an honor if you could share some of your experiences with our visitors today," he said eagerly. Sullivan shook his head. "Another time, perhaps." When they were alone again, Mark crouched beside the wheelchair. "Are you all right, Grandpa?" Sullivan's gaze remained fixed on the tank destroyer. "You know, they call me a hero, have my name on plaques, invite me to ceremonies." He gestured toward his chest full of medals. "Got all these pretty ribbons." "You earned them," Mark said. Sullivan turned to his grandson, his eyes suddenly fierce with an intensity that took Mark aback. "You want to know the truth, the real story behind all this?" "Of course." Sullivan's voice dropped. "I disobeyed direct orders, risked court-martial. Could have ended my career before it really began. Hell, could have been shot for some of what I did." A thin smile crossed his lips. "But I'd do it all again, every damn bit of it." Mark glanced around the museum. Maybe we should find somewhere more private for this conversation. Later, in their hotel suite overlooking the Norman coastline, Sullivan sat by the window, a glass of bourbon in his hand. The golden liquid caught the late afternoon sun as he swirled it contemplatively. Mark sat across from him, leaning forward, elbows on knees. "So all those stories you told me growing up, sanitize," Sullivan said. "Appropriate for a kid, the official version." He took a sip of bourbon. "But you're not a kid anymore. You're a soldier, a tank commander, just like I was. You deserve the truth." He set his glass down. "Because someday, Mark, you might find yourself in the same position I was, having to choose between following orders and doing what you know is right." The setting sun cast long shadows across the room as Sullivan's mind traveled back across the decades to another summer in Normandy. "It all started in July of 1904, he began, about a month after the initial landings. The earth trembled beneath them as the Tiger fired again. Captain Richard Shadow Sullivan pressed himself against the stone wall of the ruined French farmhouse, debris raining down around him. The sound of the German 88 was distinctive, a sharp crack followed by a roar that seemed to tear the very air apart. "Jesus Christ," muttered Sergeant Frank Miller, crouched beside him. "That's the third Sherman." Sullivan peered cautiously around the corner. Through his binoculars, he could see the burning wreckage of the American tanks scattered across the field beyond. Black smoke poured from their hatches. Some of the crews had made it out. Many hadn't. "One Tiger," Sullivan said, his voice tight with controlled rage. "One goddamn Tiger taking out an entire company." The massive German tank sat partially concealed at the edge of a tree line 800 yards away, its long barrel tracking methodically for new targets. The surviving Sherman crews were pinned down, unable to retreat across the open ground without being cut to pieces. "Our 3-inch pop guns won't do a damn thing to that monster from this distance," Miller said, referring to their M10 tank destroyer's main armament. "We'd have to get within 300 yards, and that's suicide against that 88. Sullivan knew he was right. The M10 had been touted as America's answer to Germany's heavy armor, but its 3-inch guns struggled to penetrate the frontal armor of a Tiger even at close range. And getting close was nearly impossible against a gunner who could pick you off while you were still half a mile away. "We need to get a radio to call in air support," Sullivan decided. "There's a working SCR somewhere in what's left of Fox Company." "I'll go, Captain," Miller offered. Sullivan shook his head. "Your wife's expecting. I'll go." Before Miller could protest, Sullivan was moving, staying low, using the hedgerows and scattered ruins for cover. The terrain of Normandy had proven perfect for German defensive operations. The ancient hedgerows divided the landscape into small compartments, limiting visibility and channeling American armor into killing zones. The acrid smell of burning fuel and scorched metal grew stronger as Sullivan approached the nearest destroyed Sherman. The tank's turret had been blown completely off, a testament to the deadly jack-in-the-box effect when a Sherman's ammunition detonated. He was checking for survivors when he heard the weak call. "Sully? That you?" Sullivan froze. He knew that voice. "Walter?" He scrambled around the tank's hull and found Lieutenant Walter Hayes half-propped against the rear wheel, his tanker's uniform soaked in blood from a massive wound in his abdomen. Hayes had been Sullivan's roommate at Officer Candidate School, had stood as best man at Sullivan's wedding. Sullivan knelt beside his friend, already knowing from experience there was nothing to be done. Hayes's face was ashen, his breathing shallow. "Hang on, Walt, we'll get you to the medics." Hayes managed a weak smile. "Don't lie to a dying man, Sully. Bad form." He coughed, blood speckling his lips. "Tiger got us before we even saw it. Went through our front plate like it was paper." Sullivan gripped his friend's hand. "Save your strength." Hayes shook his head slightly, his eyes suddenly intense. "Listen to me. This is important." He drew a labored breath. "They didn't give us a chance, not a fighting chance. We're using the wrong weapons, Sully." His hand clutched weakly at Sullivan's jacket. "Promise me. Promise you'll do something." "I promise," Sullivan said, his throat tight. Hayes nodded slightly, satisfied. His grip relaxed. "Tell Ellie I wasn't scared. Tell her." But whatever message Walter Hayes had for his wife went unspoken. His eyes grew distant, fixed on something Sullivan couldn't see. Then he was gone. Sullivan stayed motionless for several long moments, still holding his friend's hand. Around him, the battle continued. Artillery fire thumping in the distance, machine guns chattering sporadically. But in that small space behind the burning Sherman, time seemed suspended. Finally, Sullivan gently closed his friend's eyes. As he did so, he noticed something protruding from the pocket of Walter's jacket. He withdrew it, a crumpled, blood-stained intelligence report. Scanning it quickly, Sullivan felt a cold rage building inside him. The report, dated 6 months earlier, detailed the capabilities of the new German Tiger tanks based on captured examples in Tunisia. It outlined their superior armor, the devastating effectiveness of their 88mm guns, and their ability to engage and destroy American tanks at ranges well beyond the effective reach of Sherman's 75mm weapons. Most damningly, it concluded, current American tank and anti-tank weapons will be inadequate against this threat in the coming European campaign. 6 months. They'd known for 6 months, and yet they'd sent men like Walter Hayes into battle with tanks that might as well have been made of tin for all the protection they offered. The Tiger fired again. Another explosion, another American crew dead or dying. Sullivan carefully folded the blood-stained report and tucked it into his own pocket. Then he retrieved the radio from Walter's tank, which by some miracle was still functional, and made his way back to his position. When he returned to Miller, the sergeant took one look at his face and asked, "What happened, Captain?" Sullivan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he called in their coordinates and requested air support, though he knew it would likely be too late for the trapped Sherman crews. When he finished, he turned to Miller. His expression hardened into something the sergeant had never seen before. "Frank, I need everything you know about the new 90mm anti-aircraft gun." Miller looked surprised. "The anti-aircraft gun? I worked on a few during stateside training. Damn fine piece of equipment." "What?" "Because we're going to need a bigger gun to kill these cats," Sullivan said. "And I think I know where to find one." Richard Sullivan had not always been a soldier. Before the war, he'd been an engineer at the Chrysler plant in Detroit, specializing in engine design and weapon systems. When Pearl Harbor happened, he'd enlisted immediately, his technical background earning him a commission and accelerated training. At 38, he was older than most captains, a fact that had earned him the somewhat ironic nickname Shadow, as in shadow of his former youth. The name had stuck, though many who served under him suspected it had more to do with his ability to appear silently wherever he was least expected. His background in automotive engineering had given him an appreciation for the mechanical aspects of warfare that many career officers lacked. While others saw tanks merely as weapons platforms, Sullivan understood them as intricate systems where design choices created both opportunities and vulnerabilities. In the weeks following Walter's death, Sullivan threw himself into understanding the enemy he faced. He personally examined every knocked-out German tank he could find, meticulously documenting armor thickness, weld quality, and impact patterns. At night in his tent, he pored over the intelligence reports he'd managed to obtain, some through official channels, others through less orthodox means. He compiled his own technical analyses, comparing the capabilities of American and German armor. The picture that emerged was grim. The M4 Sherman, the backbone of American armored forces, had been designed for mass production and reliability rather than raw combat power. Its 75mm gun could handle earlier German tanks like the Panzer III and Führer, but against Panthers and Tigers, it was hopelessly outclassed. Even the M10 tank destroyer, with its open-topped turret and 3-inch gun, was struggling to counter the latest German armor. It had been designed under the assumption that German tanks would be relatively lightly armored, emphasizing speed over protection, an assumption the Tiger had violently disproven. What troubled Sullivan most, however, wasn't just the technical mismatch. It was the institutional resistance to acknowledging the problem. Reports from the front lines were being minimized or dismissed by senior commanders who insisted that tactics, not technology, were the issue. One night, as Sullivan sat in his tent updating his increasingly detailed analysis, a messenger arrived with a letter. The familiar handwriting on the envelope sent a jolt through him. His son, Jack. Lieutenant Jack Sullivan had followed his father into the Army, though against Richard's wishes. At 22, he commanded a Sherman tank in the 2nd Armored Division, currently operating in a different sector of the front. Sullivan tore open the envelope, eyes scanning quickly over his son's words. "Dear Dad, hope this finds you well. We've been on the move constantly since breaking out of the beachhead. The men are in good spirits, though the hedgerow country is tough going for tanks. Good news, our division is being moved to support the push towards St. Lo next week. The brass says it's an important transportation hub we need to take. Maybe our paths will cross soon." Some of the veterans who fought in North Africa have been telling stories about German Tigers, trying to scare us newer guys. I tell them my old man has probably already figured out how to beat them. Have you? The guys in my platoon think my dad can solve anything. Give 'em hell. Love, Jack. Sullivan read the letter 3 times, his concern growing with each reading. St. Lo was precisely where he'd encountered the Tigers that had destroyed Walter's unit, and now Jack was being sent right into their path. He carefully folded the letter and placed it in his breast pocket, close to his heart. Then he returned to his analysis with renewed urgency. This wasn't just about honoring a promise to a dying friend anymore. His son's life hung in the balance. The next morning, Sullivan requested a meeting with his battalion commander, Colonel William Iron Bill Harrison. At 55, Harrison was West Point educated, rigid in his thinking, and deeply committed to the Army way of doing things. He had little patience for what he called civilian thinking among his officers. Harrison's command post was set up in an abandoned French schoolhouse, the walls still adorned with children's drawings and educational charts in a language the colonel couldn't read. He looked up from his paperwork as Sullivan entered and saluted. Captain Sullivan, what's so urgent that it couldn't wait for the regular staff meeting? Sullivan placed his report on Harrison's desk. Sir, I've compiled an analysis of our current anti-armor capabilities versus German heavy tanks, specifically the Tiger and Panther models. The data clearly indicates that we're facing a critical firepower gap that's costing American lives. Harrison didn't touch the report. Another one of your technical analyses, Captain? I believe we've had this conversation before. With respect, sir, this situation has gotten worse. The Germans are deploying more heavy armor to this sector, and our current weapons simply can't engage them effectively beyond point-blank range. Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying Sullivan with obvious disapproval. Captain, this is a military operation, not an engineering conference. I have reports from other units successfully engaging and destroying German armor. Those reports are misleading, sir, Sullivan countered. Yes, we occasionally destroy a Tiger or Panther, but usually through artillery air support or overwhelming numbers. When our tanks meet theirs on equal terms, we lose. Badly. The problem isn't our equipment, Captain, it's how we're using it, Harrison said dismissively. American tankers need to be more aggressive, get in closer, use our superior numbers and mobility. Sullivan felt his temper rising but fought to keep his voice level. Colonel, that's exactly the approach that got Lieutenant Hayes' entire company wiped out last week. One Tiger, sir, one. They never had a chance to get in close because the German could hit them from 1,000 yards out. Harrison's face hardened. Mind your tone, Captain. Lieutenant Hayes and his men died because they failed to properly reconnoiter their route and allowed themselves to be ambushed. A tactical failure, not a technical one. Sullivan placed both hands flat on Harrison's desk, leaning forward. Sir, I personally examined the wreckage. The Sherman's 75mm rounds bounced off the Tiger's frontal armor, even at 300 yards. Meanwhile, the German 88 went through our tanks like they were made of cardboard. He tapped the report. It's all in here, with measurements and calculations. This isn't opinion, sir, it's physics. Physics won't win this war, Captain. American grit and determination will. Harrison stood up, signaling the end of the discussion. I suggest you focus less on writing reports and more on motivating your men. Spirit counts for more than specifications in combat. Sullivan straightened, his jaw tight. Spirit doesn't penetrate 100 millimeters of armor, sir. The room went silent. Harrison's face darkened dangerously. That will be all, Captain Sullivan. Dismissed. Sullivan saluted stiffly, executed a precise about-face, and marched from the room. Once outside, he paused to collect himself, frustration threatening to overwhelm his usual self-control. Men were dying, good men like Walter Hayes, while commanders like Harrison clung to outdated notions of warfare. And now Jack was heading straight into the same meat grinder. As Sullivan stood there, a jeep pulled up, and a lieutenant he didn't recognize jumped out. Captain Sullivan? General Patton would like to see you, sir. Sullivan blinked in surprise. General Patton? There must be some mistake. The lieutenant shook his head. No mistake, sir. The general specifically asked for the tank destroyer captain who's been making noise about German armor. His words, not mine, sir. Sullivan's mind raced. George Patton, commander of the Third Army, was known for his aggressive tactics and his intimate knowledge of armored warfare. Unlike many senior officers, he had extensive pre-war experience with tanks. When does the general want to see me? Now, sir, the lieutenant gestured to the jeep. If you'll come with me. The drive took them to a chateau several miles behind the lines that served as Patton's forward headquarters. Military police were stationed at regular intervals along the approaching road, checking identification with meticulous care. Inside, the chateau buzzed with activity, officers coming and going, radio operators receiving and sending messages, clerks organizing the endless paperwork of modern warfare. Through it all strode General George S. Patton, Jr., instantly recognizable with his polished helmet, riding breeches, and ivory-handled revolvers. When Sullivan was ushered into Patton's makeshift office, the general was standing over a large map table, plotting movements with his staff. He looked up as Sullivan entered and saluted. So you're the tank destroyer captain I've been hearing about, Patton said, his voice surprisingly high-pitched for such a legendary figure. At ease, Captain. We don't stand on excessive ceremony here. Thank you, sir, Sullivan said, relaxing slightly but still maintaining proper military bearing. Patton dismissed his staff with a gesture, then fixed Sullivan with an intense gaze. I've read your report on German heavy armor. Excellent technical analysis. Reminds me of some work I did at the tank school years ago. He pointed to a chair. Sit down, Captain. I want to pick your brain. For the next 40 minutes, Sullivan found himself engaged in the most detailed and informed discussion of armor tactics he'd experienced since joining the Army. Patton asked incisive questions, challenged assumptions, but never dismissed the fundamental problems Sullivan had identified. The issue, as I see it, Patton said eventually, is that we designed for a different war than the one we're fighting. Our tanks were built to support infantry, not to duel with other tanks. The Germans, on the other hand, built their heavies specifically for tank versus tank combat. Exactly, sir, Sullivan agreed. And now we're trying to make up the difference with inadequate weapons. Patton nodded thoughtfully. What would you propose as a solution, Captain, if you had a free hand? Sullivan didn't hesitate. We need a weapon with more penetrating power than the 3-inch gun on the M10. The 90mm anti-aircraft gun has the ballistic performance to deal with Tigers and Panthers, even at extended ranges. If we could mount that on a mobile platform, we'd have a fighting chance. A slow smile spread across Patton's face. It seems great minds think alike, Captain. There's a project underway at Aberdeen Proving Ground that I think would interest you. He scribbled something on a piece of paper and handed it to Sullivan. Report there in 3 days. I've had you temporarily assigned to what they're calling Project Wolverine. Use that authorization if anyone gives you trouble. Sullivan stared at the paper, then back at Patton. Sir, I'm grateful for the opportunity, but my unit will manage without you for a few weeks, Patton finished for him. This is more important, Captain. We need that weapon in the field, and we need men who understand the problem to help develop it. He stood, signaling the end of the meeting. Oh, and Captain, I'm reassigning your son's division. They won't be going to St. Lo after all. Sullivan felt a wave of relief wash over him. Thank you, sir. Patton fixed him with a stern look. Don't thank me, Captain. I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it because I need those tanks elsewhere. Never forget that in war, the mission comes first. Always. His expression softened slightly. But if it happens to keep your boy out of a bad situation for a while, consider it a fortunate coincidence. Sullivan saluted. Understood, sir. As he turned to leave, Patton called after him. Sullivan, sir, if you're right about this weapon, it could save a lot of American lives. Don't let the bureaucrats slow you down. Sometimes winning requires bending the rules. Just don't tell anyone I said that. 3 days later, Captain Richard Sullivan reported to Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. The sprawling facility served as the Army's primary testing ground for weapons and vehicles, its thousands of acres echoing daily with the sound of experimental ordnance. The guard at the security checkpoint examined Sullivan's orders from General Patton with raised eyebrows, but waved him through without comment. A waiting jeep took him deep into the facility, past firing ranges and vehicle test tracks, to a large hangar with no identifying markings. Another checkpoint, another examination of his authorization. This time, the security was provided by counterintelligence officers rather than regular MPs. Finally, Sullivan was escorted into the cavernous interior of the hangar. Inside, he found organized chaos. Engineers in civilian clothes worked alongside Army technicians. Half-assembled vehicles stood in various states of completion. The air smelled of metal, oil, and ozone from welding equipment. Captain Sullivan? Sullivan turned to find a bespectacled man in his early 60s approaching. Despite his age, he moved with surprising energy, his eyes sharp behind thick glasses. I'm Dr. Raymond Cooper, civilian technical advisor to Project Wolverine. General Patton sent a message that you'd be joining us. He offered his hand, which Sullivan shook. I understand you've had some first-hand experience with our German friends' feline tanks. More than I'd like, Doctor, Sullivan replied grimly. I've seen what they can do to our current vehicles. Cooper nodded. Then you'll appreciate what we're trying to accomplish here. He led Sullivan through the workshop toward the far end of the hangar. The problem, as I'm sure you've discovered, is that our standard 3-inch gun lacks the muzzle velocity to reliably penetrate the frontal armor of the latest German designs, particularly at combat ranges. I've documented instances where shells bounced off Tigers at distances as close as 300 yards, Sullivan confirmed. Precisely. So we needed something with more punch. They reached a cordoned-off area where a large gun was mounted on a test stand. This is our answer, the 90mm M3 gun. Sullivan examined the weapon with professional interest. It was substantially larger than the 3-inch gun he was familiar with, its long barrel promising significantly enhanced ballistic performance. Originally designed as an anti-aircraft weapon, Cooper explained, but we've adapted it for the anti-tank role. Initial tests show it can penetrate the frontal armor of a Tiger at ranges up to 1,000 yards with the right ammunition. Sullivan felt a surge of hope. This was exactly what American tank crews needed. The challenge, Cooper continued, leading him past the gun to where a vehicle stood under canvas, was finding a suitable platform. Designing an entirely new tank would take too long, so we've taken a more expedient approach. He pulled back the canvas to reveal what appeared to be an M10 tank destroyer chassis fitted with a new larger turret. Meet the T-71 gun motor carriage, Cooper said with evident pride, or as it will be designated once approved for production, the M36. Sullivan walked slowly around the vehicle, taking in every detail. The hull was familiar, the same basic Sherman chassis used for the M10. But the turret was entirely new, larger and more rounded to accommodate the massive 90mm gun. We've kept the open top design from the M10, Cooper explained, saves weight and gives the crew better visibility, though it does leave them more exposed. Trade-offs, Sullivan murmured, continuing his inspection. Always trade-offs in design. Cooper smiled approvingly. Exactly, we could have waited for a perfect solution, a fully enclosed heavy tank with the 90mm gun, but that would have taken years to develop and produce. This, he patted the hull, this we can put into production almost immediately using existing manufacturing capacity. It's not perfect, but it will give our boys a fighting chance right now. Sullivan completed his circuit of the vehicle and looked at Cooper. When can we get them to the front? That, said a new voice, is where you come in, Captain Sullivan. Sullivan turned to see a full colonel approaching, accompanied by several officers. Unlike Cooper, the colonel moved with the precise bearing of a career military man. His uniform was impeccable, his posture perfect. Colonel James Thornton, project director, the man introduced himself. General Patton speaks highly of your practical experience with German armor, Captain. We need that perspective here. Sullivan saluted. Happy to help in any way I can, sir. Thornton nodded briskly. Good, because we have a problem. The Ordnance Department is dragging their feet on approval. They want more testing, more validation. Meanwhile, armored forces pushing for priority to be given to developing an entirely new heavy tank rather than what they see as another stopgap tank destroyer. Sullivan felt a familiar frustration building. More bureaucracy while men were dying. So where do I fit in, Colonel? We need someone who can articulate the urgent need for this weapon based on actual combat experience, Thornton explained. Someone who can counter the theoretical arguments with hard reality. General Patton thinks you're that man. Sullivan looked back at the prototype M36, its 90mm gun aimed symbolically at the future. He thought of Walter Hayes, Walter Hayes dying beside his burning Sherman, of his son Jack, still at risk despite Patton's temporary reassignment, of all the tank crews facing German heavy armor with inadequate weapons. When do we start, sir? For the next 3 weeks, Sullivan became immersed in Project Wolverine. By day, he worked with the engineers, offering insights from his combat experience that helped refine the M36's design. He spent hours on the firing range, testing the 90mm gun against replicated German armor plate, documenting its performance with meticulous precision. By night, he wrote detailed reports and prepared briefings for the various committees and boards whose approval was needed to move the project forward. His practical knowledge of battlefield conditions, combined with his engineer's understanding of technical specifications, made him an effective advocate. Yet progress remained frustratingly slow. Every advance was met with new objections, new delays. The armored force continued to push for resources to be diverted to long-term tank development. The Ordnance Department raised concerns about the open-top turret and the vehicle's high profile. Politics, Cooper explained one evening as they reviewed the latest round of test results. The Army is no different from any other large organization, Captain. Fiefdoms, empires, competing interests. Some genuinely believe their approach is best. Others just don't want to admit they backed the wrong horse. Sullivan rubbed his tired eyes. Meanwhile, good men are dying. Cooper nodded solemnly. I know, that's why we keep pushing. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. Colonel Thornton called Sullivan to his office, where he found a classified intelligence report waiting. This just came in, Thornton said without preamble. The 2nd Armored Division was ambushed near Carentan 3 days ago. Heavy casualties. Sullivan felt his blood run cold. The 2nd Armored? That's my son's unit. Thornton's expression softened slightly. I know. I checked the casualty list immediately. Lieutenant Sullivan is listed as wounded, not killed. That's all the information I have. Sullivan gripped the edge of the desk, relief and renewed fear washing over him in equal measure. Jack was alive, but wounded. How badly? The report wouldn't say. There's more, Thornton continued gently. The ambush was conducted by a company of Tiger IIs, King Tigers, even heavier armor than the original Tiger. Sullivan absorbed this information with growing dread. The original Tiger was formidable enough. The Tiger II, with its improved armor, sloping, and even more powerful gun, would be nearly invulnerable to current American tank weapons. The 90mm gun, he said finally, will it be effective against the King Tiger? Cooper, who had joined them, grimaced. Based on our calculations, it will struggle against the frontal glosses at normal combat ranges. But with the new HVAP ammunition we're developing, and hitting from the flanks or rear, he spread his hands. It's still our best option in the short term. Sullivan straightened, his decision made. We need to get these M36 to the front now, Colonel. No more delays, no more committees. I don't care what it takes. Thornton exchanged a look with Cooper. General Patton called this morning. He's authorized us to send the first 5 prototype M36s to his command for field testing. Technically, they're still experimental, not approved for general deployment. But they'll be in combat, Sullivan finished. Yes, and he specifically requested that you accompany them, Captain, as the technical advisor. 2 days later, Sullivan was on a transport plane bound for England, the first leg of his journey back to the front. In a cargo hold behind him were crated components for 5 M36 tank destroyers to be assembled at a depot near the coast before being ferried to France. As the plane droned over the Atlantic, Sullivan withdrew a worn photograph from his breast pocket. It showed Jack at his OCS graduation, young and proud in his new officer's uniform. Sullivan had taken the photo himself just before shipping out. Now Jack was wounded somewhere in France, victim of the very tanks Sullivan had been warning about. The thought twisted in his gut like a knife. He hadn't been able to protect Walter. He hadn't been able to protect Jack. But maybe, just maybe, he could still make a difference for the thousands of other American tank crews still facing the German beasts. The M36 with its 90mm gun wasn't a perfect weapon. It wasn't the equal of the Tiger II in armor or even firepower. But it would give American forces something they desperately needed, a fighting chance. As the English coast came into view below, Sullivan made a silent promise to himself. He would get these tank destroyers into combat, whatever it took. He would prove their worth on the battlefield, not in committees. And if that meant bending or even breaking the rules, so be it. Some risks were worth taking, some battles had to be fought, regardless of the cost. And some vengeance was long overdue. The English depot hummed with activity as Sullivan supervised the assembly of the 5 prototype M36 tank destroyers. Rain pattered against the metal roof of the hangar, a constant backdrop to the sounds of wrenches tightening bolts and engines being tested. The scent of fresh paint, motor oil, and damp concrete filled the air. Captain, we have a problem with the traverse mechanism on Unit 3, reported Sergeant Wilson, a stocky mechanic with 30 years of experience working on tanks. Sullivan wiped his hands on a rag and followed Wilson to the vehicle in question. Despite traveling across the Atlantic in carefully designed crates, some components had still suffered damage. Every delay grated on Sullivan's nerves. Somewhere in France, American tank crews were still facing German Panthers and Tigers with inadequate weapons. Can we fix it with what we have? Sullivan asked, examining the damaged parts. Wilson scratched his graying stubble. Maybe, but it won't be factory perfect. We're not looking for perfect, Sergeant. We're looking for functional. Good enough to fight. Yes, sir, I'll make it work. Sullivan clapped the man on the shoulder and moved on to the next vehicle. The work continued around the clock, crews of mechanics rotating in shifts. Sullivan barely slept, catching moments of rest on a cot set up beside the tanks. 4 days later, all 5 M36s were assembled and operational. Sullivan stood before them, their olive drab paint still wet in places, and felt a surge of grim satisfaction. They weren't the elegant, perfectly engineered machines the Germans produced, but they had something more important: the raw power to fight back. Colonel Harrison's reaction to Sullivan's return with 5 experimental tank destroyers was predictably frosty. The battalion commander sat behind his desk in the commandeered French chateau that now served as headquarters, reading through the authorization from General Patton with evident displeasure. "So you went over my head to Patton," he said finally, looking up at Sullivan. "That's a dangerous game, Captain." I went where I was ordered, sir, Sullivan replied carefully. General Patton requested my assistance with Project Wolverine based on my technical background. Harrison's eyes narrowed. And now you return with 5 untested vehicles and orders that I'm to incorporate them into my battalion for field evaluation. Do you have any idea of the logistical complications this creates? The training requirements? The maintenance issues? With respect, sir, I've brought 5 weapons that can actually hurt a tiger, something we've been sorely lacking. And who's supposed to crew these experimental vehicles? I don't have trained personnel to spare. Sullivan had anticipated this objection. I've taken the liberty of identifying potential crew members from our existing M10 units, sir. Men with mechanical aptitude who can adapt quickly to the new systems. I can train them myself. Harrison leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. You seem to have thought of everything, Captain. I've tried to, sir. The situation is urgent. Indeed. Harrison was silent for a long moment. Then, very well. You have 2 weeks to train your crews and prove the combat effectiveness of these M36s. After that, I'll make my recommendation to Third Army regarding their wider deployment. Sullivan had hoped for more enthusiastic support, but this was better than outright rejection. Thank you, sir. You won't regret it. I already do, Captain. Harrison shuffled papers on his desk. One more thing, your son, Sullivan tensed. Sir? Lieutenant Sullivan is recovering at the 128th Evacuation Hospital. His wounds were serious but not life-threatening. Shrapnel to the left leg and arm. Harrison's tone softened slightly. You can have 48 hours to visit him before you begin this training program. That's the best I can do under the circumstances. Relief washed through Sullivan. Thank you, Colonel. I appreciate it. Harrison waved his hand in dismissal. Don't thank me, Captain. Just make sure these new tank destroyers are worth the trouble they're causing. Dismissed. The 128th Evacuation Hospital was a collection of large tents and a few requisitioned buildings near the rear areas of the American lines. The smell of antiseptic barely masked the underlying odors of blood and gangrene. Rows of wounded men filled every available space, their groans and occasional screams punctuating the bustling activity of doctors and nurses. Sullivan found Jack in a corner of one of the larger tents, his left leg elevated and heavily bandaged. His left arm was similarly wrapped from elbow to fingers. Despite his injuries, Jack's face lit up when he saw his father. Dad, what are you doing here? Sullivan embraced his son carefully, mindful of his wounds. Checking on my boy. What else? He pulled up a folding chair beside the cot. Up close, he could see the toll the fighting had taken on Jack. The young man's face was gaunt, with dark circles under his eyes. He'd aged years in the months since they'd last seen each other. How bad is it? Sullivan asked, nodding toward the bandaged limbs. Jack shrugged, then winced at the movement. Doc says I'll keep everything. Might have a limp, and 2 fingers on my left hand won't bend right anymore. Could have been a lot worse. What happened? Jack's eyes darkened. Tiger Twos, a whole company of them. We never stood a chance, Dad. He looked down at his hands. My gunner, Pete Martinez? Known him since basic. He'd just gotten a letter. His wife had a baby girl. He was showing us all pictures. Jack swallowed hard. Direct hit on our turret. Martinez, Davis, and Chen never made it out. I was half out of the hatch when it hit. That's the only reason I'm here. Sullivan squeezed his son's uninjured right hand. I'm sorry, Jack. Our rounds just bounced off them, Dad. We might as well have been throwing rocks. The bitterness in Jack's voice cut Sullivan deeply. The brass told us the Shermans would be enough, that we had the numbers to overwhelm them. But you can't overwhelm something you can't hurt. I know. That's why I'm here, actually. I've brought something that might help even the odds a bit. Sullivan told Jack about the M36 and its 90mm gun. As he described the technical details, he saw the spark of interest reignite in his son's eyes. Jack had inherited his father's engineering mind. So you're saying this thing can actually kill a tiger? Jack asked. Or a panther, even the king tigers, if you hit them right. It's not perfect, but it's a hell of a lot better than what we've had. Jack nodded slowly. Good, that's good, Dad. He looked up, his expression suddenly fierce. Make them pay for Martinez and the others. Promise me. Sullivan met his son's gaze. I promise. When Sullivan returned to the battalion 2 days later, he found his 5 M36s moved to a secluded training area away from the main camp. Sergeant Frank Miller was already there, clipboard in hand, looking over the assembled men who would form the crews. Captain, Miller greeted him with a salute. I've selected the best candidates from the volunteers as instructed. 25 men total, 5 full crews. Sullivan nodded approvingly. Good work, Frank. Let's meet them. The men stood at attention as Sullivan approached. They were a mixed group, some young, barely out of their teens, others older veterans with the weathered look of men who had seen too much combat. All had been chosen for their technical aptitude and willingness to learn. At ease, Sullivan ordered. I'm Captain Sullivan. For the next 2 weeks, I'll be training you on the most powerful anti-tank weapon in the American arsenal, the M36 tank destroyer with the 90mm gun. He pointed to the vehicles behind him. These are prototypes, the first of their kind to reach the European theater. They're not perfect. They have quirks and issues we'll discover together. But they can do one thing that no other American armored vehicle currently can. They can kill a Tiger tank from 1,000 yards away. A murmur ran through the assembled men. Make no mistake, Sullivan continued, this won't be easy. We have 2 weeks to master vehicles that crews would normally train on for months. We'll work day and night if necessary, but when we're done, you'll be the first American tank destroyer crews with a fighting chance against the best German armor. He paused, looking each man in the eye. Any questions? A lanky corporal raised his hand. Sir, if these are prototypes, are we going into actual combat with them? That's exactly what we're doing, Corporal. These vehicles need to prove themselves in battle before they'll be approved for general production. We're not just training crews, we're proving a concept. Another man spoke up, a staff sergeant with a thick Boston accent. What about spare parts, sir? If these are prototypes, what happens when something breaks? Good question, Sergeant. We have a limited supply of critical components, and we'll need to be creative with repairs. That's why I've selected men with mechanical experience. Sullivan gestured to the vehicles. These M36s are based on the M10 hull, so many components are interchangeable. The main difference is the turret and gun system. There were a few more questions about technical specifications and operational procedures. Sullivan answered each one directly, not sugarcoating the challenges they faced, but emphasizing the opportunity to make a real difference. One last thing, Sullivan said as the briefing concluded. What we're doing here goes beyond standard procedure. We're rushing these vehicles into combat because our fellow tankers need them desperately. Some people in the chain of command aren't happy about that. They think we're moving too fast, taking unnecessary risks. His voice hardened. They're wrong. Every day we delay is another day American tank crews face Tigers and Panthers with inadequate weapons. Remember that when the training gets tough. The training regimen Sullivan established was brutal. Mornings began before dawn with classroom instruction on the technical aspects of the M36, particularly the new 90mm gun and its fire control systems. Afternoons were spent in practical exercises, loading drills, target acquisition, maintenance procedures. Evenings continued with tactical discussions and more maintenance work. The 90mm gun presented particular challenges. It was significantly more powerful than the weapons these men were accustomed to, with greater recoil and different ballistic characteristics. The ammunition was heavier, requiring adjustments to loading techniques. The key advantage of this weapon is its high muzzle velocity, Sullivan explained during one session, drawing diagrams on a blackboard set up in the field. That means flatter trajectory, less need to elevate for distant targets, and more importantly, greater penetrating power. He showed them the special high-velocity armor-piercing rounds that would be their primary anti-tank ammunition. These HVAP rounds can penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor at ranges up to 1,000 yards, but they're in limited supply, so you need to make every shot count. By the end of the first week, the crews were showing promise. They'd mastered the basic operation of the vehicles and were beginning to understand the tactical doctrine Sullivan was developing. Unlike traditional American tank destroyer doctrine, which emphasized speed and ambush tactics, Sullivan was teaching them to use the M36's superior firepower to engage German tanks from beyond the effective range of the enemy's weapons. The M36 isn't as fast as the M18 Hellcat, he told them, but it has something better, a gun that can reach out and kill at distances where the enemy can't effectively return fire. That's our advantage, and we need to exploit it. During a live fire exercise against mock targets, Sullivan observed each crew carefully, making notes on their performance. Most were doing well, but one crew stood out. The team led by Staff Sergeant Tommy Winters, the Bostonian who had asked about spare parts. Winters had assembled a remarkably efficient crew. His gunner, Corporal Eddie Collins, a 19-year-old from Georgia with a natural talent for ballistics, was consistently hitting targets at ranges that impressed even Sullivan. His loader, Private First Class George Wilson, a former Kansas farmer with enormous strength, could manhandle the heavy 90 millimeter shells with surprising speed. The driver, technician 5th grade Sam Goldstein, a Jewish engineer from New York, handled the M36 with a precision that belied its size and weight. Sergeant Winters, Sullivan called as the crew climbed down from their vehicle after the exercise. A word, please. Winters approached, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. Sir, your crew is performing exceptionally well, particularly your gunner. Where did Collins learn to shoot like that? Winters grinned. He was a hunting guide in the Appalachians before the war, sir. Says shooting a moving tank isn't much different from shooting a running deer, just bigger. Sullivan nodded. Well, he's the best I've seen. Your whole crew is. I'm putting you in the lead vehicle when we deploy. Winters' expression sobered. When will that be, sir? Soon. Intelligence reports indicate German armor massing for a counterattack near Arracourt. Third Army wants us to reinforce the units there. Sullivan checked to ensure they couldn't be overheard. This will be our test, Sergeant. The brass will be watching to see how the M36 performs in actual combat conditions. We won't let you down, sir. I know you won't. Just keep your crew focused. We're almost ready. That night, Sullivan sat alone in his tent, reviewing the day's training notes by the light of a kerosene lamp. The crews were progressing well, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they needed more time. 2 weeks was an impossibly short period to master such complex vehicles. A shadow fell across the entrance to his tent. Permission to enter, sir? It was Frank Miller. Come in, Frank. Sullivan set aside his notes. What's on your mind? Miller ducked through the tent flap and stood awkwardly, helmet in hands. Just wanted to check how you think we're doing, sir. Honestly. Sullivan gestured for Miller to sit on the camp stool across from him. Honestly, better than I expected. Not as well as I'd like. But we're out of time. The German counterattack won't wait for us to finish training. Miller nodded grimly. The men know what's at stake, sir. They'll be ready. I hope so. Sullivan rubbed his tired eyes. How's morale? Good, considering. They're nervous, of course. Combat is always frightening, but going into battle with untested equipment adds another layer. Miller hesitated. There's been some talk, though. What kind of talk? About Colonel Harrison, sir. Word is he's not happy about this project. Some of the men are worried he's setting us up to fail. Sullivan wasn't surprised. Harrison had made no secret of his skepticism about the M36 program. Let me worry about the colonel, Frank. You focus on getting your crew ready. Yes, sir. Miller rose to leave, then paused. One more thing, sir. Sergeant Winters asked me to pass along that his crew fixed the elevation mechanism issue on their gun. Goldstein figured out a modification that makes it more responsive. Thought you'd want to know. Sullivan felt a surge of pride. This was exactly the kind of initiative and problem-solving that would make the difference in combat. Tell them good work and have Goldstein document the modification. We might need to apply it to the other vehicles. After Miller left, Sullivan returned to his notes, adding Goldstein's modification to the growing list of improvements they'd developed. Despite the challenges and the pressure from above, he felt a growing confidence in his crews and their machines. They would be ready. They had to be. The next morning, Sullivan was summoned to battalion headquarters. He found Colonel Harrison in conference with several staff officers, all gathered around a large map table. Captain Sullivan, Harrison said, looking up from the map. Join us. We were just discussing the situation at Arracourt. Sullivan studied the map. It showed the current American positions around Arracourt, a small town in the Lorraine region of France, in the suspected German counterattack routes. Intelligence indicates elements of the 5th Panzer Army are preparing a major thrust in this area, Harrison continued, tracing a line on the map. Primarily Panther tanks, though there are reports of Tigers as well. General Patton wants your M36 units deployed as part of our response. Sullivan kept his face neutral, not revealing his satisfaction at this news. When do we move out, sir? Tomorrow morning. Your crews will be attached to Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division. Harrison's tone made it clear he wasn't entirely comfortable with this arrangement. I'm told you've been developing special tactical doctrine for these vehicles. Care to enlighten us? Sullivan moved to the map and indicated the rolling terrain around Arracourt. The M36's 90 millimeter gun gives us an engagement range advantage over the German tanks. I've been training the crews to exploit that by taking up hold-down positions on high ground, engaging enemy armor from maximum effective distance. One of the staff officers, a Major Sullivan didn't recognize, looked skeptical. Standard tank destroyer doctrine emphasizes mobility and ambush tactics, Captain. What you're describing sounds more like a static defense. Not static, sir. Mobile defense in depth, Sullivan clarified. The M36 is less about speed and more about firepower. We can engage German tanks before they can effectively return fire. That's the advantage we need to exploit. Harrison studied Sullivan with narrowed eyes. Your approach contradicts established doctrine, Captain. Established doctrine was developed before we faced tigers and panthers in significant numbers, sir. The situation has changed. There was an uncomfortable silence as Harrison and Sullivan locked eyes. Finally, the colonel nodded curtly. Very well, Captain. You'll have your chance to prove your theories at Arracourt. Just remember, the reputation of this battalion rides on the performance of your experimental vehicles. I understand, sir. Good. Report to Combat Command, a headquarters by 0800 tomorrow. They'll integrate your units into their defensive plan. Harrison returned his attention to the map. That will be all, Captain. Sullivan saluted and left, his mind already racing through final preparations. Tomorrow would be the true test, not just of the M36, but of everything he'd been fighting for since Walter's death. That afternoon, Sullivan gathered his crews for a final briefing. He had a large map similar to the one at headquarters spread out on the hood of a jeep. Arracourt, he said, pointing to the location. Rolling countryside, good visibility from the high ground, limited forest cover. Ideal terrain for our purposes. We'll be supporting elements of the 4th Armored Division against what intelligence believes will be a major German counterattack. Primarily Panthers, with possible Tiger support. The men crowded around, studying the map intently. Sullivan could see the tension in their faces, the nervous energy that preceded combat. Our primary mission will be to engage and destroy enemy armor at maximum effective range. We'll operate in 2 sections. Sergeant Miller will command vehicles 2 and 3. I'll take vehicles 1, 4, and 5 with Sergeant Winters as my lead driver. Sullivan traced the likely approach routes for the German armor. Initial positions will be here, here, and here, providing overlapping fields of fire. He spent the next hour detailing their tactics, answering questions, and addressing concerns. When the formal briefing concluded, he spoke with each crew individually, checking their readiness and boosting morale where needed. Winters and his crew were making final adjustments to their M36 when Sullivan approached. All set, Sergeant? He asked. Winters nodded. Yes, sir, just fine-tuning the traverse mechanism based on Goldstein's modifications. Applied the same fix to all 5 vehicles. Sullivan watched as Goldstein, partially hidden inside the turret, made delicate adjustments to the mechanism. Good man, we'll need every advantage tomorrow. Collins, the gunner, looked up from cleaning the 90mm gun's breech. Sir, what's the real story on these German tanks? Are they as good as they say? Sullivan considered his answer carefully. These men needed confidence, but they also needed truth. The Panther is an excellent design. Good armor, excellent gun, decent mobility. The Tiger is even more heavily armored, though less mobile. Both are formidable opponents. He patted the massive gun barrel of the M36. But with this, in proper tactics, we have more than a fighting chance. Wilson, the loader, hefted one of the heavy 90mm shells. How many of these special HVAP rounds do we get, sir? 10 per vehicle, Sullivan admitted. Use them wisely when you have a clear shot at the heavier German tanks. Standard AP rounds will handle Panthers at closer ranges or when hitting their side armor. The men nodded, absorbing this information. Sullivan was impressed by their focus and professionalism. Despite the rush training and the pressure of the upcoming battle, they carried themselves like veterans. Get some rest, he told them. We move out at dawn. The night before battle always had a particular quality, a strange mixture of tension and calm. Sullivan walked among the parked M36s, checking and rechecking details, unwilling to leave anything to chance. The moon cast long shadows across the olive-drab vehicles, their silhouettes unfamiliar compared to the more common Shermans and M10s. He paused beside the lead vehicle, the one he would ride into battle tomorrow. Someone had stenciled a name on its gun barrel in small white letters, Vengeance. Sullivan traced the letters with his fingers, thinking of Walter Hayes dying beside his burning Sherman, of Jack lying wounded in the field hospital, of all the American tankers who had faced the German beasts with inadequate weapons. Yes, vengeance was exactly what these vehicles were designed to deliver. As he stood there lost in thought, he became aware of a presence behind him. He turned to find Colonel Harrison watching him from a few yards away. Couldn't sleep either, Captain? Harrison asked, approaching. Final checks, sir, Sullivan replied. Want to make sure everything's ready for tomorrow. Harrison nodded, his gaze moving over the M36. In the moonlight, his face seemed older, the lines deeper. Impressive weapon, he admitted reluctantly, if it performs as advertised. It will, sir. The men are ready. Harrison was silent for a long moment. Then unexpectedly he said, I served in the Great War, you know. Tank Corps, though we didn't have many back then. Primitive things compared to what we use now. He shook his head. Lost a lot of good men to German 77mm guns that could tear our tanks apart while we couldn't reach them. Sullivan realized this was the most personal conversation he'd ever had with his commanding officer. Harrison continued, I see the same thing happening again. Our boys going up against superior German armor. That's why I've been pushing so hard for improved tactics, for better use of what we have. He met Sullivan's gaze directly. We may disagree on the approach, Captain, but never think I don't care about the men. I never thought that, sir, Sullivan said, and was surprised to realize he meant it. Harrison was rigid and traditional, but he wasn't callous. Good. Harrison looked back at the M36. I'm still not convinced these are the answer, but I hope to God I'm wrong. He straightened, his professional demeanor returning. 0800 tomorrow, Captain. Don't be late. No, sir. With a curt nod, Harrison walked away, leaving Sullivan alone with his thoughts and the silent tank destroyers. Dawn broke with a thin mist clinging to the fields and roads. The 5 M36 tank destroyers moved in column along the narrow French country road, engines growling in the early morning quiet. Sullivan stood in the turret of the lead vehicle, scanning the countryside ahead. They reached the 4th Armored Division's command post shortly before 0800. The unit was already at full alert, preparing for the expected German attack. Sullivan reported to the commanding officer, Colonel Abrams, a burly, aggressive tank commander who had already made a name for himself in the campaign. So you're the M36 man, Abrams said, looking Sullivan up and down. Patton mentioned you might be joining us, said you have a tank destroyer that can actually hurt a Panther. That's right, sir, Sullivan confirmed. The 90mm gun gives us the range and penetrating power to engage German heavy tanks effectively. Abrams nodded briskly. Good, because intelligence says we've got a whole battalion of the bastards heading our way. He led Sullivan to the command tent where a large map was laid out. Here's the situation. We've established defensive positions along these ridge lines. My Shermans are hull down here and here. I want your M36s integrated into this defense, but with freedom to relocate as the battle develops. Sullivan studied the map, noting the excellent observation positions on the high ground. Perfect terrain for our purposes, sir. We can engage from maximum range, force them to come to us. That's the plan. The morning fog works in our favor. German armor will have limited visibility, might blunder right into our sights. Abrams checked his watch. Get your vehicles into position. We expect contact within the hour. Sullivan saluted and returned to his tank destroyers. He quickly issued orders, sending Miller with 2 M36s to the northern sector, while he led the remaining 3, including Winter's crew, to positions on the southern ridgeline. The morning fog persisted as they moved into position, reducing visibility to a few hundred yards. Sullivan ordered the vehicles to take up hull-down positions, with only their turrets and guns visible from the front. Then they waited. The sound came first, the distinctive growl of Maybach engines carrying through the mist. Then dark shapes began to materialize, the angular silhouettes of Panther tanks advancing in loose formation across the open fields. Sullivan felt his heart rate increase. This was it, the moment of truth for the M36. Target Panther tank, range 800 yards, 2 o'clock, he called to Collins, who was already tracking through the gunner's sight. Identified, Collins replied, his voice steady. HVAP loaded. Sullivan keyed his radio. All M36 units hold fire until my command. Let them get closer. The Panthers continued their advance, unaware of the American positions in the fog. Sullivan counted at least 10 vehicles with more shapes emerging from the mist behind them. When the lead Panther was approximately 700 yards away, Sullivan gave the order. All units engage targets. Fire at will. Collins fired first, the 90mm gun roaring and rocking the M36 with its recoil. Through his binoculars, Sullivan watched the tracer streak through the fog and strike the lead Panther squarely in the turret face. There was a bright flash as the armor-piercing round penetrated, followed by secondary explosions as ammunition inside the German tank detonated. Target destroyed, Sullivan reported. Shift fire, next target. All along the ridgeline, the M36s opened fire. The 90mm guns created a distinctive bass note that stood out from the sharper cracks of the 76mm guns on the upgraded Shermans nearby. The Germans, suddenly under effective fire from an unexpected range, reacted with confusion. Some Panthers attempted to return fire, their 75mm guns searching for targets in the fog. Others began evasive maneuvers, trying to find cover that didn't exist in the open fields. Sullivan's radio crackled with reports from his other vehicles. 2, 3 Panthers down. Miller's section reporting 1 Tiger spotted, extreme range. The fog was beginning to lift as the morning sun strengthened. Sullivan could now clearly see the battlefield below. At least 5 Panthers were burning, black smoke joining the dissipating fog. The remaining German tanks were attempting to withdraw to a tree line several hundred yards back. All units, maintain fire, prevent their withdrawal, Sullivan ordered. Miller, use HVAP on that Tiger. The 90mm guns continued their deadly work. Another Panther erupted in flames as a round penetrated its thinner side armor. The Tiger, recognizing the threat, was attempting to turn its heavier frontal armor toward the American positions while retreating. Miller's voice came over the radio. Tiger targeted, firing now. Sullivan watched as the HVAP round struck the Tiger's upper front plate at an angle. There was no penetration, but the impact sheared off part of the tank's track. The massive vehicle slewed to one side, immobilized. Hit it again, same spot, Sullivan ordered. The second shot struck within inches of the first. This time, the weakened armor gave way, and the round penetrated into the Tiger's engine compartment. Black smoke began pouring from the rear deck. The German counterattack was collapsing. Without the expected breakthrough by their heavy armor, the supporting infantry were falling back. American artillery began pounding their retreat routes. Colonel Abrams' voice came over the command net. All units, advance and pursue. Don't let them regroup. Sullivan ordered his M36s to move forward, maintaining their advantage of height where possible. As they advanced past the burning German tanks, he could see crew members who had escaped the destruction being rounded up by American infantry. By mid-afternoon, the battle was effectively over. The German attack had been thoroughly defeated, with minimal American losses. Sullivan gathered his crews near a collection of knocked-out Panthers to assess their performance. 14 confirmed kills, he announced, unable to keep the satisfaction from his voice. 8 Panthers, 1 Tiger, 5 Panzer IVs. No M36s lost, though vehicles 2 and 4 have minor damage from artillery fragments. The men stood taller, pride evident in their bearing. They had faced the feared German tanks and emerged victorious. The 90mm gun performed exactly as expected, Sullivan continued. Penetration of Panther frontal armor at ranges up to 900 yards, side penetration at over 1,000. The Tiger proved more resistant, as anticipated, but vulnerable to multiple hits or shots at its weaker points. Winters stepped forward. Sir, Collins says the gun exceeded his expectations for accuracy. He was able to hit specific aim points on the German tanks even through the fog. Sullivan nodded. Excellent. Document all your observations. This information will be crucial for the after-action report. As they were speaking, a jeep approached, kicking up dust from the dirt road. Colonel Abrams himself jumped out, striding toward their gathering. Captain Sullivan, he called. Hell of a show your M36s put on today. Sullivan saluted. Thank you, sir. Abrams surveyed the destroyed German tanks around them. Never seen anything like it. Panthers burning before they could even get into their effective range. That 90mm gun is something else. He turned to Sullivan. I'm putting in a formal request for M36s for my entire command. If today is any indication, these vehicles could change the equation against German armor. Sullivan felt a surge of vindication. The men deserve the credit, sir. They mastered these vehicles in record time. And they'll get it, Abrams assured him. Now I've got something to show you. Thought you might be interested. He gestured toward his jeep. Ride with me. Curious, Sullivan followed Abrams to the jeep. They drove several kilometers to a collection point for damaged American vehicles. Parked among the various Shermans and half-tracks were 2 King Tigers, their massive hulls intact despite battle damage. Captured yesterday by elements of the 37th Tank Battalion, Abrams explained as they approached the behemoths. Mechanical breakdowns, crew abandoned them. Technical intelligence teams are on their way, but I thought you'd want a closer look first. Sullivan circled the nearest King Tiger, studying its armor layout and construction. The frontal glacis was sloped at a steep angle, with armor thickness he estimated at over 100 mm. The massive 88mm KWK-43 gun extended far beyond the front of the hull, Impressive machines, he admitted. Our standard 76mm guns would be practically useless against this frontal armor. Abrams nodded grimly. That's why your M36s are so important. The 90mm might be our only mobile weapon that stands a chance. He paused, seeming to debate whether to continue. There's something else you should know. These two Tigers were part of a special company commanded by Colonel Hans Weber. Mean bastard, responsible for the ambush that hit your son's unit. Sullivan froze. Weber? You're certain? Intelligence confirmed it. He's developing new heavy tank tactics specifically to counter American armor. These two were part of his command, but got separated during a night march. Abrams studied Sullivan's face. Thought you'd want to know who we're up against. Weber, the name burned itself into Sullivan's mind. The man responsible for the attack that had wounded Jack and killed so many others. Now Sullivan had a name, a specific target for the anger that had driven him since Walter's death. Thank you for telling me, sir, Sullivan said, keeping his voice neutral. It's useful to know the enemy's command structure. Abrams clapped him on the shoulder. You'll get another crack at Weber and his Tigers. Intelligence says he's regrouping for another attempt in the coming days. With your M36s in the field now, maybe we can give him a proper American welcome. That evening, Sullivan sat alone in his temporary quarters, a converted room in a French farmhouse near the 4th Armored's command post. On the table before him lay his detailed notes on the day's battle, the performance of the M36s, and the captured King Tigers he'd examined. The M36 had proven itself beyond his expectations. The 90mm gun had performed magnificently, giving American forces the ability to engage German heavy tanks on something approaching equal terms for the first time. The tactical doctrine he'd developed had worked exactly as intended, allowing the tank destroyers to exploit their range advantage while minimizing exposure to enemy fire. Yet Sullivan felt strangely unsatisfied. They had won today, yes, but Weber was still out there, still commanding his Tiger unit, still posing a threat to American tanks and their crews. And now the battle had become personal in a way Sullivan hadn't anticipated. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Enter, he called. Colonel Harrison stepped into the room, removing his helmet. He looked tired but composed. Colonel, Sullivan said, rising, I didn't expect to see you here. Came forward to get a first-hand report, Harrison replied. Heard your M36s did well today. 14 confirmed kills, sir, no losses. Harrison nodded, seemingly unsurprised. I've read the preliminary reports. Impressive performance. He paused, then added, You were right, Sullivan, about the need for more powerful anti-tank weapons. I was overly committed to existing doctrine. The admission clearly didn't come easily to Harrison. Sullivan appreciated the gesture for what it was, a professional soldier acknowledging a mistake and moving forward. Thank you, sir, but it wasn't just about the weapon. The men made it work, their training, their courage. Indeed. Harrison moved to the table, glancing over Sullivan's notes. I'm recommending immediate deployment of all available M36s to frontline units, with priority to those facing German heavy armor concentrations. General Patton has already approved. Sullivan felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The M36 would go into full production, would be deployed where needed most. Walter's death, Jack's wounds, they hadn't been in vain. There's more, Harrison continued. I'm promoting you to major, effective immediately. General Patton agrees we need someone with your technical knowledge and combat experience to oversee the M36 deployment across 3rd Army. Sullivan was stunned. Sir, I thank you. Don't thank me yet, Sullivan. Your new role comes with significant challenges. Harrison's expression turned grave. Intelligence reports that the Germans are rushing reinforcements to this sector, including additional Tiger units. They're planning something big, possibly aimed at the critical bridge at Remagen. Weber, Sullivan said quietly. Harrison looked at him sharply. You know about Colonel Weber? Colonel Abrams mentioned him, said he commanded the Tiger unit that ambushed my son's company. Harrison nodded slowly. Yes, that's him. Hans Weber, tank warfare theorist, decorated commander, and one of Germany's most effective armored leaders. He's been given command of a special heavy tank battalion, primarily King Tigers. Their mission appears to be to spearhead a counterattack aimed at recapturing key crossing points over the Moselle and eventually the Rhine. Sullivan studied the map on the wall, tracing the likely routes such an attack might take. When? Soon. Days, not weeks. Harrison fixed Sullivan with an intense gaze. Your M36s will be crucial to stopping them. I need you to expand your training program, get more crews ready, and develop tactics specifically to counter these King Tigers. The challenge was enormous, but Sullivan felt a grim determination settling over him. This was what he had been working toward all along, the chance to give American tank crews a fighting chance against the best German armor. And if that meant a confrontation with Weber, the man responsible for so much American blood, well, that would be justice of a sort. I'll need additional resources, Sullivan said, already planning. Maintenance personnel, training facilities, priority on ammunition, especially the HVAP rounds. You'll get what you need, Harrison promised. Patton's made this a priority. He sees the M36 as key to maintaining our momentum eastward. As Harrison turned to leave, Sullivan asked, "Sir, what do we know about Weber personally? His background, his methods?" Harrison paused at the door. Former engineering professor at the Technical University of Berlin, tank commander in Poland and France, wounded in Russia, then brought back to help develop the Tiger II. Brilliant tactician by all accounts. Why do you ask? Sullivan kept his voice carefully neutral. Know your enemy, sir. If I'm to develop effective countermeasures, I need to understand his approach. Harrison studied him for a moment, then nodded. I'll have intelligence send over their file on him. But remember, Sullivan, this is about stopping the German counteroffensive, not personal vendettas. Of course, sir, the mission comes first. After Harrison left, Sullivan returned to his notes, but his mind kept circling back to Weber, an engineer like himself, a tank theorist turned commander. In another life, they might have been colleagues, exchanging ideas at technical conferences. Instead, they were deadly enemies, each using his knowledge to destroy the other's men and machines. Sullivan opened his footlocker and removed a small wooden box. Inside was his service pistol, a M1911 A145 caliber, and a framed photograph of Jack on his graduation day from officer candidate school. Sullivan looked at his son's young, proud face, then at the weapon beside it. Weber was out there, planning his next move. Sullivan would be ready. The M36 had proven itself in battle, but the war was far from over. The real test was still to come. The late winter rain fell in steady sheets, turning the ground to mud and reducing visibility to mere yards. Major Richard Sullivan stood on the ridgeline overlooking the Remagen Bridge, water streaming down his helmet and coat. Through his binoculars, he could make out the massive stone towers of the bridge, one of the last intact crossings over the Rhine into Germany itself. 6 weeks had passed since the battle at Arracourt. 6 weeks of relentless advancement, pushing the German forces back toward their homeland. 6 weeks in which Sullivan had overseen the deployment of more M36 tank destroyers to frontline units, training crews, and developing tactics to counter the increasing presence of German heavy armor. Now they faced what intelligence suggested would be a major counterattack. Hans Weber and his Tiger Battalion had been identified moving toward Remagen. Their objective was clear: destroy the bridge and halt the American advance into Germany. Sullivan lowered his binoculars and turned to the young lieutenant beside him, rain dripping from both their helmets. Radio status report to all M36 units, he ordered. I want confirmation they're in their assigned positions. Yes, sir, the lieutenant replied, hurrying back to the command half-track parked a few yards away. Sullivan had positioned his force of 15 M36 tank destroyers along the western approaches to the bridge, integrated with elements of the 9th Armored Division. The defensive plan exploited the M36's superior range and the advantageous terrain, giving them clear fields of fire across the likely German attack routes. Sergeant Tommy Winters approached, slogging through the mud. His face was drawn with fatigue after days of preparation, but his eyes remained alert. All vehicles fueled and armed, sir, he reported. HVAP rounds distributed, 10 per vehicle, as you ordered. Sullivan nodded. The special high-velocity, armor-piercing ammunition remained in short supply, despite his constant requests up the chain of command. Each precious round would need to count. Weather report? Sullivan asked, glancing at the low gray sky. No improvement expected for at least 24 hours, Winters replied. Air support is grounded, just as Jerry would want it. Sullivan grimaced. The Germans had learned to fear American air power. An attack under such poor visibility made tactical sense, eliminating one of the key Allied advantages. But the rain presented problems for both sides. German tanks would be limited to roads and firm ground, making their approach more predictable. Get some rest while you can, Sergeant, Sullivan advised. I have a feeling tomorrow's going to be a long day. Before Winters could respond, the lieutenant came splashing back through the mud. Major Sullivan, urgent message from Forward Observation Post 3. They're reporting engine sounds. Multiple heavy vehicles moving toward grid section Baker 5. Sullivan immediately consulted his map, protected from the rain beneath a waterproof cover. Baker 5 was an approach through a small valley about 3 miles east of their position. Contact Colonel Anderson at Division, Sullivan ordered. Tell him we have possible enemy armor movement consistent with our primary threat assessment. Then alert all M36 units to stand by. As the lieutenant hurried to relay the orders, Sullivan turned to Winters. Looks like we might not get that rest after all, Sergeant. Have your crew ready to move in 5 minutes. The rain intensified as darkness fell, turning the already difficult conditions into a nightmarish landscape of mud and poor visibility. Sullivan's command half-track followed Winters' M36, now christened Vengeance by its crew, along a narrow country road toward the forward observation post. 2 additional M36s trailed behind, forming a small, quick reaction force. The radio crackled with updates from the observation post. Definite identification of German armor, estimated 8 to 10 vehicles. Possibly Tigers based on engine sound. Sullivan knew Weber would likely lead with his heaviest tanks, using their superior firepower and armor to punch through the American lines. They reached the observation post, a camouflage position on a small hill overlooking the valley approach. The sergeant in charge, a veteran reconnaissance man named Davis, briefed Sullivan on what they detected. First spotted them about an hour ago, sir, Davis explained, raising his voice over the drumming rain. Sound carries oddly in this weather, but my boys are certain they're hearing Maybach engines, Tiger class. They've been moving slowly, probably due to the conditions. Sullivan peered through the observation slit, but the darkness and rain made it impossible to see more than vague shapes in the valley below. Any infantry support spotted? He asked. Negative, sir, but in this weather they could have a battalion down there and we wouldn't see them until they were on top of us. Sullivan considered the situation. This could be the lead element of Weber's main force, or it could be a probing attack to test American defenses before the real assault. I need certainty, he decided. Sergeant Winters, take Vengeance forward along the East Ridge. Get eyes on those vehicles, confirm their type and number, then pull back. Do not engage unless directly threatened. Winters saluted. Yes, sir. Collins has that new Starlight scope we received last week. Might help pierce this soup. Good thinking. Report back as soon as you have confirmation. As Winters departed, Sullivan studied the map, plotting potential deployment zones for his remaining M36. If this was indeed the vanguard of Weber's force, positioning would be critical. The M36's advantage lay in engaging German heavy tanks at ranges beyond the effective reach of their own weapons. But that required proper terrain and clear fields of fire. 30 tense minutes passed before the radio crackled with Winters' voice. Major Sullivan, this is Vengeance. We have visual confirmation. 8 King Tigers moving in column along the valley road, plus what appears to be 2 Panther recovery vehicles behind them. Sullivan felt his pulse quicken. 8 King Tigers represented a significant force, the heaviest tanks in the German inventory. Their 88 medium guns could destroy any American tank at extreme ranges, and their frontal armor was nearly impervious to most Allied weapons. Any unit markings visible? Sullivan asked, thinking of Weber. Negative, sir. Too dark and wet. But these aren't just any Tigers. They're moving with precision, maintaining proper intervals despite the conditions. Veteran crews. That sounded like Weber's unit. The German colonel was known for his disciplined operations and well-trained men. Pull back to Point Charlie, Sullivan ordered. I'm deploying the rest of the section to positions overlooking the valley exit. We'll set an ambush where the road crosses the open ground near the Martins' farm. Copy that. Pulling back now. Wait. There was a pause, then Winters' voice returned with increased urgency. Sir, they've stopped. Looks like they're deploying in a defensive formation. They may have spotted us. Sullivan tensed. Withdraw immediately, Sergeant. Do not engage. Attempting to withdraw, sir, but we're... The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by static. Sullivan grabbed the radio handset. Vengeance, come in. Sergeant Winters, report. No response. Sullivan turned to the communications specialist. Keep trying to reach them. I'm taking the other 2 M36s forward to provide support. Within minutes, Sullivan was in the turret of the lead M36, advancing cautiously along the ridge road toward Winters' last known position. The rain had slackened slightly, but visibility remained poor, limited to the cone of light from the tank destroyer's covered headlamp. Suddenly, the night erupted with the distinctive crack of the German 88mm gun, followed by the flash of muzzle fire from the valley below. The rounds sailed over their position, a ranging shot that splashed into the mud behind them. "Contact!" Sullivan shouted. "Enemy armor engaging from the valley floor. All units deploy to pre-planned positions Alpha and Bravo." The M36s smoothly moved into hull-down positions along the ridge, only their turrets and guns exposed to enemy fire from below. Sullivan used his binoculars to scan the darkness, spotting the distinctive silhouettes of the King Tigers now advancing up the valley slope. Target identified. King Tiger, range approximately 1,000 yards, moving uphill at bearing 035. The gunner in Sullivan's vehicle, a steady-handed corporal from Minnesota, adjusted his sight. "Target acquired, sir. HVAP loaded. Fire when ready." The 90mm gun roared in the night, its muzzle flash briefly illuminating the rain-soaked landscape. Through his binoculars, Sullivan watched the tracer arc toward the King Tiger. The round struck the upper frontal glacis at an angle, creating a shower of sparks but failing to penetrate the heavy armor. "Target undamaged," Sullivan reported. "Adjust aim for turret ring, same target." Before the gunner could fire again, multiple 88mm rounds came screaming toward their position. One struck just below Sullivan's M36, showering the vehicle with mud and rocks, but causing no damage. The second hit the M36 to their right, penetrating its thinner side armor. The vehicle erupted in flames, its crew bailing out into the mud and rain. Sullivan grabbed the radio. "All units, adjust positions. They have our range." His driver expertly backed the M36 down the reverse slope of the ridge, then advanced to a new firing position 50 yards to the left of their previous location. As they moved, Sullivan caught a glimpse of Vengeance, Winter's M36, its distinctive profile visible in the flash of German gunfire. The tank destroyer appeared intact but was positioned awkwardly on the forward slope, exposed to enemy fire. "Target Vengeance's location," Sullivan ordered his gunner. "Lay suppressing fire between them and the advancing Tigers. Give them cover to withdraw." The 90mm gun fired repeatedly, sending high explosive rounds into the ground between Winter's stranded vehicle and the advancing German tanks. The explosions kicked up mud and smoke, obscuring the area. Sullivan switched radio frequencies. "Vengeance, this is Sullivan. We're providing cover fire. Withdraw to Rally Point Delta immediately." To his relief, Winter's voice came through. "Copy that, Major. Engine damaged but mobile. Withdrawing now." Through gaps in the smoke and rain, Sullivan could see Vengeance limping backwards up the slope, its engine coughing but functioning. Around it, the night was alive with muzzle flashes as the M36s and King Tigers exchanged fire in the darkness. Despite the chaos, Sullivan felt a cold clarity settling over him. This was not Weber's main attack. It was too small, too focused. This was a reconnaissance in force, testing American defenses and responses before the main assault. "All units, begin staged withdrawal to secondary positions," Sullivan ordered. "This is not the main enemy thrust. I repeat, this is not the main attack." The M36s began pulling back in sequence, maintaining covering fire for each other. Sullivan's vehicle was the last to withdraw, ensuring Vengeance and the crews of the damaged M36 made it safely back to American lines. By dawn, the skirmish was over. The German force had probed American defenses, but withdrawn before committing to a full engagement. Sullivan had lost one M36 destroyed and two damaged, including Vengeance. In exchange, they'd confirmed the presence of King Tigers and damaged at least one, though in the darkness and rain, it was difficult to assess the full impact of their fire. Sullivan gathered his officers and senior NCOs in a farmhouse serving as their temporary headquarters. Maps were spread across a wooden table, illuminated by kerosene lamps that cast long shadows on the stone walls. "What we faced last night was a reconnaissance element," Sullivan explained, circling an area on the map. "Their main force is still here, preparing for the real attack. Based on the pattern of probing actions, I believe they'll come through here, along the Holzdorf Road, then swing north toward the bridge approaches." Colonel Anderson, the division commander who had joined the briefing, studied the map thoughtfully. "That assessment aligns with our intelligence. The question is timing." "Today," Sullivan said with certainty. "The rain is supposed to clear by mid-afternoon. They'll want to move before we can bring in air support." Anderson nodded. "I'll position our reserves accordingly. Your M36s will be our primary anti-tank defense. Where do you want them?" Sullivan indicated several positions on the high ground overlooking the likely German approach. "Here, here, and here. Interlocking fields of fire, maximum standoff range. If we can engage their heavy armor before they reach our main defensive line, we can disrupt their entire attack plan." As the officers dispersed to prepare their units, Sergeant Winters approached Sullivan. "Vengeance will be back in action within the hour, sir," he reported. "Goldstein is finishing repairs on the fuel line now." "Good work, Sergeant. I want you in the center position here." Sullivan pointed to a spot on the map. "You'll have the best field of fire across the entire approach." Winters studied the position, then looked at Sullivan with understanding. "That's where you expect to find Weber, isn't it, sir?" Sullivan met his gaze steadily. "Intelligence suggests he commands from the center of his formation. If we can neutralize their command vehicle, it might disrupt their entire attack." Winters nodded, asking no further questions. He'd been with Sullivan long enough to understand the personal dimension of this confrontation. By mid-morning, Sullivan's force of now 13 operational M36s was positioned according to his plan. The rain had diminished to a light drizzle and visibility was improving by the hour. Sullivan established his command post at an abandoned church on high ground, giving him a clear view of the expected battlefield. Through his binoculars, he scanned the terrain methodically. The land below was a patchwork of fields, small woodlots, and narrow country roads, all leading toward the vital Remagen bridge, just visible in the distance. In German hands, the bridge would allow them to move reinforcements freely across the Rhine. In American hands, it provided a direct route into the German heartland. "Movement, sir," reported the observation specialist beside him. "Multiple vehicles, heavy class, emerging from the tree line at grid reference Delta 7. Sullivan shifted his binoculars to the indicated area. There they were. The distinctive box-like shapes of King Tiger tanks, their long 88mm guns pointing forward like accusing fingers. He counted 8, 10, 14, 20 vehicles in total, plus accompanying infantry and support vehicles. A full battalion, with the King Tigers forming the armored spearhead. "Contact division," Sullivan ordered. "Inform them that enemy armor is advancing along the expected route. Battalion strength, heavy tanks in the lead. We are engaging per plan Baker." As the radio operator relayed the message, Sullivan switched to the command frequency for his M36 units. "All M36 elements, this is Sullivan. Enemy armor advancing into our engagement zone. Hold fire until they reach phase line red. I repeat, hold fire until phase line red." Phase line red was Sullivan's designation for the optimal engagement range, where the M36's 90mm guns would be most effective against the King Tiger's frontal armor. It represented a calculated risk, close enough to ensure penetration with their limited supply of HVAP rounds, but far enough to stay beyond the effective, accurate range of the German 88s. The German force continued its advance, moving with the precision and confidence that characterized Weber's command style. Sullivan could almost feel the German colonel's presence, directing this armored thrust toward the vital bridge. When the lead Tiger crossed phase line red, Sullivan gave the order. "All units, commence firing. Priority targets are the command vehicles in the center of the formation." Along the American positions, the 90mm guns of the M36s opened fire nearly simultaneously. Through his binoculars, Sullivan watched as the first round struck the German tanks. Most deflected off the heavily sloped frontal armor, but one HVAP round found a vulnerability in a Tiger's turret ring, disabling the vehicle instantly. The German response was immediate and ferocious. The King Tigers halted and began returning fire, their 88mm guns seeking out the American positions. Despite being hauled down, 2 M36s were hit in the initial volley, one brewing up in flames as its ammunition cooked off. Sullivan grabbed the radio handset. "All units, adjust fire to target tracks and running gear. Immobilize them in the open." The strategy was sound. An immobilized tank was far less effective, and hits to the less protected running gear and tracks were more likely to succeed than attempts to penetrate the thickest armor. The battle intensified as more American units joined the engagement. Sherman tanks from the 9th Armored provided supporting fire, while artillery began falling among the German infantry accompanying the tanks. Yet the King Tigers pressed forward, seemingly unstoppable despite taking hits. Sullivan focused his binoculars on the center of the German formation, searching for the command vehicle. King Tigers all looked similar, but command tanks often had additional radio antennas or subtle markings. There, the 5th vehicle in the second line. It had multiple antenna arrays and moved with particular purpose, other tanks adjusting their positions in response to it. "Vengeance, this is Sullivan. Target the Tiger with dual antennas, approximately 800 yards at your 11 o'clock position. I believe that's Weber's command vehicle." Winter's acknowledgement came immediately. "Target identified. HV app loaded, firing now. Sullivan watched as Vengeance's 90mm gun fired, the shell tracing a line through the light rain toward the target. It struck the upper turret of the command Tiger, creating a spray of metal and sparks but failing to penetrate fully. Target damaged but operational, Sullivan reported. Hit it again, same location. Before Vengeance could fire a second round, the command Tiger's gun swiveled toward its position and fired. The 8mm shell struck just below Vengeance's turret, rocking the vehicle violently but failing to penetrate its sloped frontal armor. We're okay, Winters reported, his voice tight with tension. Reloading HV app. The battle had developed into a massive firefight across the rolling terrain. King Tigers and M36s dueled at long range, while Sherman tanks engaged the lighter German vehicles. Infantry on both sides fought for control of key terrain features. The air filled with smoke, dust, and the concussive thunder of tank guns. Sullivan maintained his focus on the tactical situation, shifting M36s to counter German movements, directing artillery fire to disrupt infantry support, and coordinating with adjacent units. Yet his attention repeatedly returned to the duel between Vengeance and the command Tiger, which had developed into a personal contest between two vehicles, two crews, two commanders. Winters fired again, another HVAP round streaking toward the command Tiger. This time, the shell struck the junction between turret and hull, finding a relative weak point in the armor. Smoke began pouring from the German tank, but its gun remained operational, returning fire immediately. The shell missed Vengeance narrowly, exploding against the hillside behind it and showering the vehicle with dirt and rock fragments. Winters adjusted position slightly, maintaining his engagement with the damaged but still dangerous German tank. Sullivan switched to a direct channel to Vengeance. Sergeant, that Tiger is damaged but still fighting. What's your HVAP status? 2 rounds remaining, sir, Winters replied, making them count. Sullivan made a quick decision. I'm bringing my vehicle up to support you. We'll hit it from 2 angles. He scrambled down from his observation post to the M36 waiting below, quickly briefing the crew as he climbed into the commander's position. The driver expertly maneuvered the tank destroyer along a prepared path to a firing position on the right flank of Vengeance's location. From this new angle, Sullivan could see that the command Tiger was indeed severely damaged, with smoke continuing to pour from its engine compartment. Yet it remained in position, directing the German attack, its guns still tracking and firing at American positions. The sheer determination displayed by its crew was both admirable and frustrating. Target the junction of hull and turret right side, Sullivan instructed his gunner. HVAP. The 90mm gun roared, sending its deadly projectile toward the Tiger. The round struck precisely where aimed, creating a new fountain of sparks and debris. The German tank shuddered under the impact, but incredibly remained operational. These damn things just don't know when to quit, the gunner muttered as he reloaded. Sullivan keyed his radio. Vengeance, fire when ready. Let's finish this. Winters' acknowledgement came as his gun fired again. This time, the HVAP round punched through the already weakened armor at the turret ring. A moment later, Sullivan's M36 fired as well, its shell striking the rear engine deck where the armor was thinner. The combined hits proved too much for the King Tiger. Flames erupted from its hatches, followed by secondary explosions as the ammunition began to cook off. The massive vehicle, pride of German engineering, became a funeral pyre for its crew, or so Sullivan thought. Through his binoculars, he caught movement at the commander's hatch. A figure emerged, pulling himself painfully from the burning vehicle. Even at this distance, the officer's insignia was visible on the man's uniform. Weber, it had to be. As Sullivan watched the German commander, his uniform smoldering, helped another crew member from the tank. Despite his own injuries, Weber was dragging his wounded comrade clear of the burning vehicle. Cease fire on that target, Sullivan ordered immediately. They're bailing out. Both American tank destroyers held their fire as more of the German crew emerged from the stricken Tiger. 3 men made it out before the tank's ammunition storage detonated completely, turning the vehicle into a raging inferno. Without its command element, the German attack began to falter. Individual King Tigers fought on fiercely, but the coordinated thrust toward the bridge disintegrated into separate, isolated actions. American artillery pounded the now exposed German infantry, while the M36s continued to engage and destroy the heavy tanks one by one. By late afternoon, the battlefield had fallen strangely quiet. The German attack had been repulsed, their remaining forces withdrawing to defensive positions well away from the bridge approaches. The Americans had suffered losses, But the M36s had proven their worth, confirming Sullivan's faith in the weapon system and the tactics he'd developed. In the aftermath, Sullivan made his way across the churned mud of the battlefield toward the burnt-out hull of Weber's command tank. Medical teams were already working in the area, treating wounded from both sides without discrimination. He found Weber sitting on the ground beside his destroyed Tiger, his uniform blackened, a field dressing wrapped around his left arm. An American medic was checking his wounds while military police stood guard nearby. Despite his situation, the German officer maintained a dignified bearing that commanded respect. Sullivan approached slowly, his sidearm holstered, hands visible to show he posed no threat. The MPs tensed but allowed him to approach when they saw his rank insignia. Weber looked up as Sullivan's shadow fell across him. Their eyes met in mutual recognition, not of faces, but of kindred spirits, tank commanders, engineers, men who understood the brutal mathematics of armored warfare. "Colonel Weber," Sullivan said in greeting, his German heavily accented but understandable. Weber nodded slightly. "You have the advantage of me, Major." "Sullivan, Richard Sullivan." Something flickered in Weber's eyes. "Ah, the M36 commander. Your new tank destroyer has proven formidable." "Your King Tigers are impressive machines," Sullivan replied. "But sometimes the perfect weapon isn't as effective as the right weapon at the right time." Weber gave a small, pained smile. "A lesson we Germans often forget, I fear. We pursue engineering excellence at the expense of practical application." He glanced at the burning wreckage of his command tank. "Though I admit it is difficult to consider the M36 superior when looking at our comparative armor protection." Sullivan followed his gaze. "Armor isn't everything. Your 88 outranges our 90mm, but we were able to deploy in positions that maximized our advantages while minimizing yours." "Tactically sound," Weber acknowledged. "You targeted the command tank specifically?" "Yes." Weber nodded thoughtfully. "Personal or strategic?" Sullivan considered the question. The truth was complex, both personal, given what Weber's unit had done to Jack's company, and strategic, given the importance of disrupting the German command structure. "Both," he admitted finally. Weber seemed to understand. "War makes all things personal eventually, Major Sullivan. Even as we move pieces on a strategic map, we remember the faces of our comrades who no longer sit beside us." The German officer winced as the medic adjusted his bandage, then continued. "I commanded the action at Carentan last month. Perhaps you had men there." "My son," Sullivan said quietly. "Lieutenant Jack Sullivan, 2nd Armored Division. He survived, but many of his friends didn't." Weber's expression showed genuine regret. "I'm sorry for this. Truly, I have a son also studying engineering in Berlin, or he was before the bombing began." He shook his head slowly. "This war has taken too much from too many." An American jeep approached, carrying officers from Division Intelligence. They had come to take Weber for formal processing and interrogation. As the German colonel was helped to his feet, he turned once more to Sullivan. "Major, may I ask why you ordered your tanks to cease fire when we were abandoning our vehicle? You could have killed us all as we emerged." Sullivan met his gaze steadily. "Because the war will end, Colonel Weber, and when it does, how we fought it will matter." Weber held his eyes for a long moment, then nodded. "Danke." He straightened his posture as much as his injuries allowed and added, "Your M36 is a worthy opponent, Major Sullivan. I am not displeased that it was such a weapon that finally stopped us." As the jeep carried Weber away, Sullivan remained by the destroyed King Tiger, contemplating the strange encounter. The man he had viewed as an enemy, as the faceless commander responsible for so much American bloodshed, had proven to be as human as himself. A fellow engineer, a father, a professional soldier doing his duty as he saw it. The rain had stopped completely now, and weak sunshine broke through the clouds. Sullivan made his way back to his command post, where reports were already coming in from across the battlefield. The bridge at Remagen remained securely in American hands. Weber's armored thrust, the last major German counterattack in the sector, had failed. 3 days later, Sullivan stood on the eastern bank of the Rhine, watching American forces streaming across the Remagen Bridge into Germany proper. The vital crossing had held, becoming the first bridge over the Rhine to fall into Allied hands intact. Now it served as the gateway for the final push into Nazi Germany. Sergeant Winters joined him, gazing at the endless convoy of vehicles moving across the bridge. "Hard to believe we're actually in Germany, sir," Winters remarked. "When I landed at Normandy, this seemed like an impossible dream." Sullivan nodded, understanding the sentiment. A lot of good men didn't live to see this day, Sergeant. We owe it to them to finish this thing properly. Word is the brass is pretty happy with the M36's performance, Winters said. Heard they're rushing more of them to the front. Over 300 in theater now, Sullivan confirmed. With more coming, the production lines back home have been running around the clock. He felt a deep satisfaction in this. The weapon system he had championed, had risked his career for, was now recognized as vital to the American armored advance. A jeep approached, a messenger hopping out with a dispatch for Sullivan. He read it quickly, a smile spreading across his face. Good news, sir? Winters asked. The best. My son Jack is being released from the hospital next week. Doctors say he'll make a full recovery. Winters clapped him on the shoulder. That's fantastic, Major. Sullivan folded the message carefully and tucked it into his breast pocket. There's more. Division wants me to establish a formal training program for all M36 crews in the European theater. Apparently, our success rate against German heavy armor has attracted attention at SHAEF headquarters. Well-deserved attention, sir. Sullivan gazed across the Rhine toward the German heartland beyond. The war isn't over yet, Sergeant. They're still fighting ahead, but for the first time, I truly believe the end is in sight. As they stood there, a convoy of M36 tank destroyers rumbled past, their 90mm guns pointing confidently forward. Among them was Vengeance, fresh from repairs, its battle scars visible but its fighting spirit intact. Collins, the gunner, spotted Sullivan and rendered a sharp salute as they passed. Sullivan returned the salute, feeling a profound connection to these men and their machines. Together they had changed the equation of armored warfare on the Western Front, had given American tankers a fighting chance against the best German armor. Walter Hayes would have been proud. Jack would understand what his father had accomplished. And somewhere in an American POW camp, Hans Weber would know that he had been defeated not by superior numbers or overwhelming force, but by American ingenuity and determination. The sun broke fully through the clouds, illuminating the scene in golden light. Sullivan breathed deeply, sensing a shift in the world around him. The weight he had carried since Walter's death, the driving need for vengeance against the German tanks, had somehow transformed. In its place was something quieter but no less powerful. The satisfaction of a job well done, a promise kept, a future secured. The war would continue for a few more months. There would be more battles, more losses, more sacrifices. But standing there on the banks of the Rhine, watching American forces move confidently into Germany, Richard "Shadow" Sullivan knew that the darkest days were behind them. The shadow of the tiger had been lifted, and the light of victory shone on the horizon. The church bells of Lakewood, Michigan rang out across the town, their joyful peals celebrating Victory in Europe Day. Flags flew from every porch and storefront, and crowds gathered spontaneously in the streets, sharing their relief and jubilation. In a quiet corner of the local park, Richard Sullivan sat on a bench beside his son Jack. Both men wore civilian clothes, though Jack's military haircut and the way he favored his left leg marked him as a returning soldier. Hard to believe it's really over, Jack said, watching children playing nearby, their laughter a counterpoint to the memories of war that still echoed in both men's minds. In Europe, at least, Sullivan replied, the Pacific fight continues. Jack nodded soberly. Some of my friends from the hospital have already been reassigned to units preparing for the invasion of Japan. Thank God you're not among them, Sullivan said quietly. They sat in companionable silence for a time, two men who had seen the face of war and returned to tell of it. Around them, life continued its peaceful rhythms, young couples strolling hand in hand, old men playing chess, mothers watching their children with protective eyes. I got a letter from Winters last week, Sullivan finally said. He and the boys are part of the occupation force in Bavaria. Said they've been tasked with collecting and evaluating captured German armor. Jack smiled. Bet Goldstein is in heaven getting to pull apart those Panthers and Tigers. Apparently they found an entire factory of King Tiger components. Winters says Goldstein hasn't slept in days. He's so busy documenting everything. The conversation drifted to other members of Sullivan's M36 crews, updates on their whereabouts and plans. Some had remained in the Army, while others, like Sullivan himself, had returned to civilian life. He had accepted a position back at the Chrysler Corporation, his experience with tank design and engineering in high demand as the company transitioned back to peacetime production. Did I tell you I received a letter from Weber? Sullivan asked suddenly. Jack looked surprised. The German colonel? No, you didn't mention it. Sullivan nodded. He's in a POW camp in Oklahoma. Apparently, he's been helping our technical intelligence people understand some of the advanced features of the German tanks. He hesitated, then added, he asked about you, whether you had recovered from your wounds. Jack was silent for a moment, processing this. Strange to think of him as a real person, with concerns and feelings. During the war, the Germans were just the enemy, faceless. I felt the same way, Sullivan admitted, until I met him after we destroyed his tank. Then I realized he was just another engineer, another soldier, another father caught up in events beyond his control. Are you going to write back? Sullivan hadn't decided yet. Part of him wanted to maintain the connection with the German officer who, in another life, might have been a colleague rather than an adversary. Another part felt it might be disrespectful to men like Walter Hayes who hadn't survived to see the peace. Maybe, he said finally, when some more time has passed. The conversation turned to Jack's plans for the future. He had been accepted to engineering school under the GI Bill, following in his father's footsteps. The war had delayed his education, but had also given him a clearer sense of purpose. I want to build things that help people, not destroy them, he explained. But I won't forget the lessons we learned about how good engineering can save lives even in the worst circumstances. Sullivan felt a surge of pride in his son, in the man he had become despite the trauma of war. The M36 was far from perfect, and he said, but it arrived when it was needed most. Sometimes that's all we can ask of our work, that it serves its purpose when called upon. Jack nodded thoughtfully. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, about timing and purpose. He turned to look directly at his father. You know, you never really told me the full story of how you got involved with the M36 program. The unofficial version, I mean. Sullivan smiled slightly. No, I suppose I haven't. He looked across the park, gathering his memories. It began with a promise to a dying friend. As the afternoon lengthened into evening, Richard Sullivan shared the complete story of the M36 with his son. He spoke of Walter Hayes, of the blood-stained intelligence report, of his confrontation with Colonel Harrison, and unexpected support from General Patton. He described the frantic development at Aberdeen, the rushed deployment to the front, and the moment when the 90mm gun first proved its worth against German armor. Jack listened intently, occasionally asking questions but mostly absorbing his father's account. He had known pieces of the story from letters and brief conversations during the war, but now the full narrative unfolded before him. So in the end, it wasn't really about vengeance at all, Jack observed when Sullivan finished. It was about keeping a promise and protecting your fellow soldiers. Sullivan considered this. Perhaps, though there were moments when vengeance seemed like the only thing driving me forward. He sighed. War simplifies and complicates simultaneously. It reduces life to survival, but tangles our motivations beyond recognition. The park was emptying now as families headed home for dinner. The celebration continued downtown, but this quiet corner had returned to its peaceful state. We should head back, Sullivan said, rising from the bench. Your mother will have dinner waiting. As they walked toward the car, Jack asked one final question. Do you think they'll remember it, Dad, the M36? Or will it just become another forgotten weapon in another forgotten war? Sullivan paused, looking back at his son. I don't know, he admitted, but the men who served in those vehicles, who fought alongside them, who lived because of them, they'll remember. And sometimes, Jack, that's enough. He put his arm around his son's shoulders, and together they walked toward home. 2 generations of Sullivan men who had faced war and found their way back to peace. Behind them, the park settled into twilight, the shadows lengthening across the grass, no longer threatening, but simply part of the natural order of things. In the distance, the church bells continued to ring, celebrating not just victory, but the promise of tomorrow.